see you all in hell, too. You remember that. Every one of you, I'll see you in hell.
What was supposed to be a quiet sentencing turned into pure chaos when over 40 Hells Angels members inside the courtroom erupted in violence, attacking police, breaking chairs, and turning the entire floor into a battlefield. But the shocking part isn't what they did, it's why they did it. The culture of violence. To understand why courtrooms shake when Hells Angels members stand trial, we need to go back to where it all began, to the dusty streets of California in 1948, where a brotherhood was born from the ashes of World War II. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club wasn't just another group of riders looking for weekend thrills. No, this was something different, something darker, something that would grow into what federal agencies now classify as a violent criminal enterprise. The club started innocently enough. World War II veterans in Fontana, California, founded the organization, men who had seen combat, men who craved the adrenaline and brotherhood they'd experienced in war. They wanted freedom, rebellion, the open road beneath their wheels. But as the decades rolled forward, as the club expanded from a single California chapter to over 500 chapters worldwide, something fundamental shifted. What began as a motorcycle enthusiast group transformed into what law enforcement agencies like the ATF and FBI would come to recognize as an organized criminal network involved in drug trafficking, weapons distribution, and brutal acts of violence. The term 1%er became their badge of honor, a reference to the claim that only 1% of motorcyclists reject societal norms and live by their own rules. And those rules, they were enforced through intimidation, through fear, through violence that would make headlines for generations to come. The club maintains it's simply a motorcycle enthusiast group, but federal prosecutors tell a very different story, one written in blood and backed by decades of court documents, surveillance footage, and witness testimony. The rivalries that would fuel decades of bloodshed were born from rejection and territory. Take the Mongols Motorcycle Club, formed by Hispanic bikers who had been rejected by the Hells Angels. That rejection didn't just create hurt feelings. It ignited a feud that would claim lives from California to Nevada, turning public motorcycle rallies into potential war zones. The Vagos, another rival club, would become entangled in similar territorial disputes, with Northern California serving as a particular flashpoint for violent confrontations. But here's where it gets really interesting, where the mythology meets the reality. Club supporters will tell you that these violent incidents are isolated, that they're the actions of individual members, not club policy. They'll point to charitable events like toy runs, to community outreach, to the fact that thousands of members never see the inside of a courtroom. And there's some truth to that perspective. Not every Hells Angels member is a criminal. Not every chapter engages in illegal activity. However, law enforcement reports from the ATF and FBI paint a much more disturbing picture, one of a culture steeped in intimidation, where violence isn't just tolerated but expected, where criminal enterprises are protected through fear, and where the phrase "snitches get stitches" isn't just a saying but a promise. These aren't just accusations thrown around by prosecutors trying to make a name for themselves. These are findings backed by years of undercover operations, wiretaps, surveillance, and testimony from those brave enough or desperate enough to break the code of silence. The club's expansion brought with it a sophistication in criminal operations. Drug trafficking became a primary revenue source, with members involved in the distribution of methamphetamine, cocaine, and other controlled substances across state lines and international borders. Extortion rackets targeted businesses, with the club's fearsome reputation serving as the ultimate collection tool. Weapons trafficking flourished, with illegal firearms moving through networks that stretched across the country. And then there were the rules, the unwritten codes that governed life in the club. Rules about loyalty, about never cooperating with law enforcement, about defending club territory at any cost. Rules that, when broken, carried consequences far more severe than any court could impose. The phrase "patching over" took on a sinister meaning. Sometimes it meant welcoming members from absorbed clubs, but other times it meant violently forcing rival clubs to join or face destruction. The violence wasn't random, wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated, purposeful, designed to send messages. When 3 officers were injured during the 1998 Laconia Motorcycle Week riot, one struck with a hammer, another suffering a concussion, a third assaulted with pepper spray. It wasn't just a brawl that got out of hand. It was a demonstration of force, a reminder that even in public, even with police present, the club could and would strike. And it's this culture, this acceptance of violence as a tool that makes every courtroom appearance of a Hells Angels member a potential powder keg. Because when you've built your identity around refusing to recognize authority, when you've spent years, sometimes decades, living by codes that exist outside the law, being forced into a courtroom, being made to stand before a judge and jury, being sentenced to years or life behind bars, it creates a pressure that sometimes, as we'll see, explodes in dramatic and dangerous ways. The Department of Justice's classification of the Hells Angels as a criminal organization isn't based on speculation or stereotype. It's built on a mountain of evidence, from RICO prosecutions that have successfully proven the club operates as an ongoing criminal enterprise, to murder convictions, to weapons and drug trafficking cases that have resulted in sentences ranging from years to life in prison. The debate isn't really about whether violence occurs in connection with the club. The evidence on that point is overwhelming. The debate is about whether that violence is systemic, whether it's directed by leadership, whether it's an integral part of the organization's structure and identity. What we do know, what the records show without question, is that when Hells Angels members face justice, when they're led into courtrooms in shackles, surrounded by armed guards, facing victims' families and prosecutors with thick case files, tensions run high, very high, and sometimes those tensions don't just simmer. Sometimes they boil over in ways that make national headlines and leave everyone asking the same question: what drives someone to such rage, such desperation, that they're willing to explode in fury even as they face the full weight of the law? We're about to find out. The courtroom explosions. The moment arrives with agonizing slowness. The jury files in, faces carefully neutral, avoiding eye contact with the defendant. The judge takes the bench, the courtroom falling into a silence so complete you can hear the air conditioning whir. The clerk stands, paper in hand, ready to read verdicts that will determine whether a man walks free or spends the rest of his life behind bars. And in that moment, as tension reaches its breaking point, sometimes the facade of courtroom civility shatters like glass. The case of Adam Lee Hall provides a window into the emotional pressure cooker that is a high-stakes murder trial involving motorcycle gang members. Hall, a 36-year-old member of the Hells Angels from Peru, found himself facing 19 charges, including multiple counts of murder for the deaths of 3 Pittsfield men in August 2011. The victims, David Glasser, Edward Frampton, and Robert Chadwell, weren't random targets. According to prosecutors, Hall orchestrated their murders to eliminate witnesses in another criminal case. But Hall didn't just kill these men. What happened next would shock even hardened prosecutors and become a central element of the trial that would eventually convict him.
Something else to it. He said he didn't mind killing the black guy.
Can you describe how he felt when he was doing this?
When he was talking to me, he was very calm.
Key witness David Casey took the stand and described in excruciating detail how Hall had dismembered all 3 victims, chopping off their heads, arms, and legs. Casey, who had worked in construction and owned an excavator, testified that Hall approached him on August 28, 2011, asking for help burying the remains.
You were planning to leave you there.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Did you do that?
No.
Why not?
I was afraid if Cole came back, it would be serious consequences.
The threat was clear, the intimidation explicit. Casey reluctantly agreed, terrified for his own safety and the safety of his loved ones. This testimony illustrated the culture of fear that surrounds these organizations, the understanding that cooperation with law enforcement can result in deadly consequences, even for witnesses protected by the justice system. During cross-examination, the defense attacked Casey's credibility, pointing out that he had lied to police on multiple occasions. But Casey's explanation was simple and chilling. He lied because he was afraid of Hall and his associates. The brutality of the crimes was almost incomprehensible. Prosecutors described how Glasser was forced to watch the others die before him, a calculated act of psychological torture before his own murder. The dismemberment was methodical, deliberate, designed not just to dispose of bodies, but to send a message about what happens to those who cross the Hells Angels. The defense acknowledged a lack of forensic proof directly linking Hall to the crimes, arguing that despite the horrific nature of the murders, despite testimony about baseball bat beatings, no blood evidence, no fingerprints directly connected Hall to the crime scenes. But the prosecution countered with witness testimony, painting a portrait of a man who not only killed, but enjoyed it.
But did he describe to you how at the time that he
said he really enjoyed it because he liked doing things in the rain.
And when he talked about this, did he talk solely about himself, or did he ever talk about us or them?
The trial, moved from Berkshire County to Springfield due to heavy publicity, lasted nearly 4 weeks, with testimony that was so graphic, so disturbing, that even experienced court personnel found themselves shaken. And through it all, Hall maintained his composure, refusing to testify in his own defense, sitting silently as witnesses described his alleged crimes in excruciating detail. But that composure would crack during closing arguments. The outburst was brief but intense, with Hall shouting his denial, his frustration boiling over as the prosecution built its final case against him. The judge quickly restored order, but the incident highlighted the emotional pressure building as the trial neared its conclusion. The jury had been deadlocked, unable to reach unanimous verdicts, tensions rising as they deliberated for days. But after the judge's additional instructions, after being reminded of their duty and the rules of deliberation, they returned with their decision.
Whatever the jury's verdict, I ask that you be respectful of that decision and bear in mind that we are in a courtroom. If there are any emotional reactions or outbursts, I will ask the court officers to remove that person from the courtroom. Bring the jury in.
The judge's warning was clear. Emotional outbursts would not be tolerated. Security was heightened, court officers positioned strategically, ready to respond to any disruption. And then, one by one, the verdicts were read.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, hearken to your verdicts as the court has recorded them. Indictment 2009-198, count 1, charging the defendant with armed robbery. You, upon your oath, do say that the defendant is guilty.
Guilty, guilty, guilty. Hall's reaction was muted, almost defeated, a stark contrast to his earlier outburst. Perhaps the reality was finally sinking in. Perhaps he understood that the life he had known, the freedom he had taken for granted, was over. The jury's message was unambiguous. They believed the prosecution's case, believed the witnesses, believed that Adam Lee Hall was responsible for 3 brutal murders. But Hall's courtroom behavior, while dramatic, pales in comparison to the explosion of rage that would occur in another trial connected to these same murders, a trial involving Hall's co-defendant, a man whose very appearance would fuel international media attention and whose outburst would become the stuff of courtroom legend. Caius Vaiovas, convicted in a separate trial for his role in the same triple murder, reacted to his guilty verdict on September 26, 2014, with an outburst that shocked everyone present. As the jury filed out after delivering guilty verdicts on 3 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and witness intimidation, Vaiovas' composure shattered completely.
I'll see you all in hell, Louis, remember that. Every one of you, I'll see you in hell.
He screamed at the departing jurors, his voice raw with fury and desperation. The threat was explicit, the rage palpable, and the courtroom erupted in gasps and shocked reactions. The outburst gained international media attention, amplified by Vaiovas' distinctive appearance, subdermal horn implants on his forehead, and a 666 tattoo, which had made him a figure of morbid fascination throughout the trial. News outlets from the Washington Post to the New York Daily News to the UK Mirror covered the story, often focusing as much on his appearance as on the crimes themselves. The jury had deliberated for approximately 37 hours over 6 days, reflecting the complexity of a case built almost entirely on circumstantial evidence. Prosecutors argued that Vaiovas was a willing participant in Hall's plot to eliminate witness David Glasser, with the murders of Frampton and Chadwell being collateral damage in a conspiracy to silence testimony. Evidence against Vaiovas included his associations with Hall, post-crime activities, and items found in his apartment, anatomical drawings and cutting tools that suggested a fascination with dismemberment. Unlike physical violence, unlike assaults on court officers or attempts to escape, Vaiovas' outburst remained verbal. It was contained, albeit dramatically, within the bounds of the courtroom, but the message was clear, the threat unmistakable. In his mind, this wasn't over, would never be over. At sentencing on September 29, 2014, Vaiovas delivered a prepared statement maintaining his innocence.
Let me make this clear one more time before I sit down. My hand was not in this, all right? My hand wasn't in this. But if anybody thinks I'm going to hang my head today and beg for mercy, They're just as deluded in their thinking as that jury of my peers who convicted me of this.
He declared, refusing to beg for mercy, vowing to appeal, claiming the district attorney knew he was not involved but proceeded anyway. Judge C. Jeffrey Kinder imposed 3 consecutive life sentences without parole, describing the acts as depraved and underscoring the victim's suffering. Victim impact statements highlighted the personal losses, with family members labeling Veiovis as heartless and evil. Defense attorney James G. Reardon Jr. apologized for the outburst, noting it garnered global notoriety but insisting Veiovis was not as portrayed in media. The attorney emphasized that the outburst, while inappropriate, did not reflect his client's true character and stemmed from the emotional strain of facing life in prison for crimes he maintained he did not commit. Veiovis's reaction was more intense than Hall's brief interruption during closing arguments, yet both cases involved no physical escalations, a pattern common in trials with gang ties where security is heightened and defendants, despite their criminal histories and violent reputations, understand that attacking officers or attempting escape would only worsen their situations. As of 2025, Veiovis continues to pursue a new trial through the Boston College Innocence Program, with recent efforts facing delays as oral arguments have been paused due to the assigned judge's retirement. The legal challenges persist, with Veiovis's defense team arguing that the conviction was based on insufficient evidence and that the circumstantial nature of the case should have resulted in reasonable doubt. These courtroom outbursts, Hall's angry interruption during closing arguments, Veiovis's threatening tirade to the jury represent more than just emotional reactions to guilty verdicts. They reveal the profound clash between the culture of the Hells Angels, built on defiance of authority and refusal to submit to societal norms, and the reality of the justice system, which ultimately has the power to strip away freedom and impose consequences that no amount of intimidation or threats can prevent. But where did this violence come from? What created the incidents that brought these men into courtrooms in the first place? To understand that, we need to look at the rivers of blood that flowed long before any jury was seated. Rivers of blood, the incidents that led to courtrooms. The rallies were supposed to be celebrations. Thousands of motorcycles, leather vests catching the sun, the rumble of engines drowning out everything else. But when rival clubs converged on these events, when territories overlapped and old grudges simmered just beneath the surface, these gatherings transformed from peaceful rides into battlegrounds that would leave bodies cooling on casino floors and ambulances screaming through the night. Let's start in the summer of 1998 in the picturesque town of Laconia, New Hampshire, during the annual Motorcycle Week, an event that draws tens of thousands of riders from across the country. The June 1998 incident at Weirs Beach began simply enough. A group of 15 to 20 Hells Angels members had set up a vendor booth selling merchandise, soaking in the atmosphere, but then something went wrong. A passerby, someone not affiliated with any club, triggered an attack that quickly spiraled out of control. The details are brutal. 3 police officers were injured, trying to restore order. One struck deliberately with a hammer, suffering a hand injury that would take months to heal. Another sustained a mild concussion from blows to the head. A third was assaulted with pepper spray, left temporarily blinded and gasping for air. The brawl required nearly 40 officers to contain, with squad cars converging from multiple jurisdictions, sirens wailing as civilians scrambled for safety. When the dust settled and the arrests were made, 9 Hells Angels members from multiple states found themselves facing criminal charges. The legal proceedings moved relatively quickly, with all defendants eventually pleading guilty to rioting and assaulting police officers. In May 1999, sentences were handed down that ranged from 30 days in jail with fines to 4 years in prison, depending on each defendant's level of involvement and prior criminal history. One member, Michael Jacques from Bourne, Massachusetts, received 90 days and a $500 fine. But here's what really shows you the power and reach of these organizations. As part of the plea deal, all defendants were banned from the event for 2 years, and the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club itself agreed not to seek vendor licenses at Laconia Motorcycle Week. Think about that. Prosecutors forced an entire organization to stay away from a public event because their presence posed such a significant threat to public safety. Yet that incident, as violent as it was, would pale in comparison to what happened just a few years later, over 2,000 miles away in the desert heat of Nevada. April 27, 2002, the Laughlin River Run Rally, Harrah's hotel and casino. This wasn't just a fight, this was a war. The tension between the Hells Angels and the Mongols had been building for months, maybe years, over territorial disputes concerning California and Nevada turf. Both clubs wanted control. Both clubs had members willing to kill for it. And when they crossed paths on that casino floor, surrounded by hundreds of innocent bystanders, the violence that erupted would shock the nation. The brawl lasted only minutes, but in those chaotic moments, knives flashed, guns fired, and improvised weapons, chairs, bottles, anything within reach, became instruments of death. Patrons dove behind slot machines, screaming as bullets ricocheted off metal and glass. Casino security, trained for drunk gamblers and card cheats, found themselves in the middle of a gang war. When it was over, 3 men lay dead, 2 Hells Angels members and 1 Mongol. 43 others were injured, some with stab wounds that nearly killed them, others with gunshot wounds that left them permanently disabled. The casino floor looked like a massacre scene, with blood pooled on the carpet, overturned furniture creating obstacle courses, and shell casings glinting under the harsh casino lights. The federal response was massive. The ATF launched Operation Black Biscuit and related investigations, deploying undercover agents, wiretaps, and surveillance that would eventually lead to indictments of 16 high-ranking Hells Angels members on charges including RICO violations, murder for hire, and drug trafficking. But here's where the justice system's complexity shows itself. Key racketeering convictions failed. Half of the defendants pleaded guilty to lesser offenses with sentences up to 5 years, and charges were dismissed entirely against 5 others. Still, 6 Hells Angels and 7 Mongols were eventually sentenced in separate proceedings, with some receiving life imprisonment for murder-related charges. Many others took plea deals for manslaughter or assault, accepting years in prison rather than risking trials that could have resulted in life sentences. The Laughlin River Run riot didn't just result in deaths and injuries, it triggered a cascade of legal proceedings that would occupy courts for years and demonstrate just how difficult it is to prosecute organized motorcycle gangs. But the violence didn't stop. Fast forward 9 years to September 23, 2011, and we find ourselves at another casino, another violent confrontation, another death that would lead to another high-profile trial. John Esquaga's Nugget Casino in Sparks, Nevada, became the site of what prosecutors would later describe as a planned assassination. Jeffrey Jethro Pettigrew, president of the San Jose chapter of the Hells Angels, was engaged in a heated verbal dispute with members of the Vagos Motorcycle Club. The argument, like so many before it, centered on territory, specifically control over Northern California. But this time, words turned to gunfire with stunning speed. Over 50 shots were fired on the crowded casino floor, with surveillance cameras capturing every horrifying second. Pettigrew was shot 4 times and died at the scene. 2 Vagos members were also wounded in the exchange of gunfire that had casino patrons diving for cover and fleeing in panic. The legal proceedings that followed would stretch on for more than a decade. Vagos member Ernesto Gonzalez was eventually convicted on October 3, 2025 of first-degree murder, conspiracy, challenge to fight, concealed weapon, carry, and firearm discharge, all with gang enhancements. He faces life in prison without the possibility of parole, though his defense team has announced plans to appeal, arguing self-defense. The jury in that case deliberated for only 5 hours before returning guilty verdicts, suggesting the evidence, including that crystal-clear surveillance footage, left little room for doubt. A Gilroy Hells Angel received 12.5 years for his involvement in the shootout, demonstrating that even peripheral participants in these violent confrontations face serious consequences. These 3 incidents, Laconia, Laughlin, and Sparks, represent just a fraction of the violent clashes involving the Hells Angels over the past few decades. There have been bar fights that turned deadly, ambushes on highways, executions in parking lots, and countless other acts of violence that have resulted in arrests, trials, and prison sentences. The cases of Adam Lee Hall and Caius Veiovis, connected to the brutal 2011 triple murder in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, which we explored in depth earlier, illustrate how violence committed in the name of loyalty to the club, to silence witnesses and protect criminal enterprises, inevitably leads to courtrooms where that same defiance crashes against the unyielding wall of law and order. What about co-defendant David Shalhoub? Tried separately in May 2014, Shalhoub's trial reported no such outbursts, with him maintaining composure throughout, demonstrating that not all defendants react with rage when faced with accountability. Some accept their fate quietly, perhaps understanding that outbursts only provide prosecutors with additional ammunition, additional evidence of the very lack of remorse force that juries find so compelling. The broader pattern across gang-related trials shows that while verbal outbursts occur with some regularity, defendants expressing defiance, anger, or desperation as verdicts are read or sentences imposed, physical violence in courtrooms remains relatively rare. Enhanced security measures, the presence of armed court officers, and the defendant's understanding that attacking officers would result in additional charges and immediate physical consequences all contribute to keeping these emotional explosions verbal rather than physical. Yet the threat remains. Every time a high-profile Hells Angels member or any outlaw motorcycle gang member stands trial, courtrooms prepare for the possibility of violence. Metal detectors are positioned at entrances. Additional security personnel are deployed. Seating arrangements are carefully planned to separate gang members from victims' families. Emergency procedures are reviewed. Because while courtroom riots during sentencing may be rare, while the title of this video may reference an event that never quite happened in the dramatic way it suggests, the underlying reality is undeniable. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club has been involved in decades of violence that has filled morgues, hospitals, and prisons. From the 1998 Laconia riot to the 2002 Laughlin River Run massacre to the 2011 Sparks Casino shootout to the 2023 Ocean Beach hate crime attack, the pattern repeats. Violence erupts, investigations follow, arrests are made, and trials commence. And in those trials, in those moments when justice is imposed, when men who have spent their lives believing they were above the law are forced to confront the consequences of their actions, emotions run high, very high, high enough that courtrooms prepare for the worst, even as they hope for peaceful proceedings. The story of the Hells Angels and the justice system is far from over. New cases continue to emerge. Federal investigations remain ongoing. Chapters around the world continue to operate, some engaging in legitimate activities, others involved in the same criminal enterprises that have defined the club's darkest chapters. And every time another member faces justice, every time another trial begins, every time another sentencing hearing approaches, courtrooms prepare once again for the possibility that the rage and defiance will boil over, that the culture of intimidation and violence will manifest itself one more time, not on a desert highway or a casino floor, but in the heart of the justice system itself. Because in the end, that's what makes these cases so compelling, so disturbing, so impossible to look away from. They represent the collision of two worlds, one built on defiance and violence, the other on order and accountability. And when those worlds collide, when hardened criminals face the reality that their power has limits, that their threats cannot reach beyond prison walls, that the life they knew is over, sometimes they snap, sometimes they explode, sometimes, even in the face of overwhelming force, even knowing they cannot win, they rage against the dying of the light, and we watch, fascinated and horrified, as justice grinds forward, implacable and unavoidable, one verdict at a time. Click on one of the cards on your screen to see more videos like this.